You are standing at the edge of a cave. The wind smells like salt. Below you, the ocean crashes against limestone cliffs that have not changed in 40,000 years. You do not know it yet, but you are the last of your kind. Somewhere in the world, another species is spreading fast, breeding faster, and talking in ways you never learned to. This is not a myth. This actually happened. And the strange part is, the story of the last Neanderthal is not really about extinction. It is about you. Your instinct is to picture Neanderthals as slow, hunched, grunting brutes who lost a fair fight. That image is wrong. It was invented. Early 20th century scientists reconstructed a Neanderthal skeleton with severe arthritis and assumed that was the normal posture for the entire species. The mistake stuck for 100 years. Real Neanderthals stood upright. They had brains slightly larger than yours. They controlled fire, treated wounds, buried their dead, and in at least one confirmed site in Spain, they painted on cave walls thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe. That last detail matters more than it sounds. It means symbolic thought, the kind that produces art and ritual, did not begin with your species. It was already there, waiting in another mind entirely. So where does the story actually end? Most researchers point to a place called Gorham's Cave, tucked into the eastern face of the Rock of Gibraltar. Archaeologist Clive Finlayson and his team spent years excavating layers of sediment there, and what they found reshaped the entire timeline of human history. Stone tools, hearths, and butchered animal bones dated to around 28,000 years ago, thousands of years after Neanderthals were assumed to have vanished everywhere else. Gibraltar, it turns out, may have been the final refuge. A narrow peninsula backed against the sea with fresh water, shellfish, and caves, deep enough to shelter a fire from the wind. If you had to guess where the very last Neanderthal took a final breath, this jagged strip of Spanish coastline is the leading candidate. Picture the scene for a moment. You are inside that cave. The fire is small because wood is harder to find than it used to be. Outside, the climate has shifted colder and drier over centuries, squeezing the forest you once hunted in. Herds of deer and horse have moved elsewhere, chasing grass that no longer grows nearby. You adapt the way your people always have. You turn to the sea. Excavated shell middens at Gibraltar show heavy use of mussels, limpets, and other shellfish, meaning the last Neanderthals were not starving primitives. They were resourceful foragers switching strategies as the world changed around them. That should sound familiar. It is exactly what your own ancestors were doing at the same time, a few hundred kilometers to the north. Here is the twist that took decades of research to prove. You did not fully lose your neighbors, you absorbed them. In 2010, geneticist Svante Pääbo led the team that sequenced the first full Neanderthal genome, comparing it against modern human DNA from around the world. The results stunned the field. Every person on Earth with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carries somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, not as a rare exception, as a baseline. Somewhere, sometime, tens of thousands of years ago, a Neanderthal and a modern human had children together, and those children survived long enough to pass their genes forward, generation after generation, until they ended up in you. Pääbo's work later earned him the Nobel Prize because it rewrote what extinction even means. A species can stop existing as a separate lineage while still existing, quietly, inside another one. So which parts of you came from them? Researchers have traced Neanderthal-derived genes linked to skin pigmentation, hair texture, and how your immune system responds to certain viruses. Some variants appear to affect mood regulation and sleep patterns. Paleoanthropologist Chris Stringer, who has spent his career mapping the branching paths of human evolution, describes this not as one species defeating another, but as populations blending, splitting, and blending again over tens of thousands of years with borders far blurrier than the old textbook diagrams suggested. The line between us and them was never as clean as the diagrams made it look. But blending is not the whole story, and here is where it gets uncomfortable. Modern humans arrived in Europe with something Neanderthals never fully developed: dense social networks stretched across vast distances. Archaeologist João Zilhão has argued that Neanderthal groups were small, often isolated, sometimes numbering only a few dozen individuals across huge territories. Your ancestors, by contrast, appear to have maintained wider trade routes, exchanging tools, ideas, and mates across hundreds of kilometers. In a world suddenly gripped by colder, less predictable climates, that network was not a luxury, it was a survival system. If your valley failed, you had somewhere else to go, and someone else who owed you a favor. Small, isolated groups did not have that safety net. When the climate turned, they had nowhere to send word, and no one arrived to help. Think about what that means. The last Neanderthals were not wiped out in some dramatic final battle. There is no evidence of a war, a massacre, a single catastrophic event. What likely happened is quieter and somehow more unsettling. Population by population, group by group, numbers simply dwindled. A hard winter here, a failed hunting season there, fewer births than deaths, decade after decade, until one group in one cave on one coastline outlived every other pocket of Neanderthals left on the planet. And then, eventually, so did they. Try to imagine being that last person. You would not have known you were the last. There was no ceremony for it, no awareness that an entire evolutionary branch, hundreds of thousands of years old, was ending with you. You would have simply lived your life, gathered shellfish, watched the fire, maybe raised children who never made it to adulthood, or maybe you had no children at all. Extinction, in real biological terms, rarely announces itself. It just quietly stops happening, one ordinary day at a time. And this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. You carry pieces of that person inside your own cells right now. Every time researchers isolate another Neanderthal-derived gene linked to your immune response or your skin or your sleep, they are tracing a direct thread back to somebody who once stood at the edge of a cave in Gibraltar, watching the tide come in, with no idea their species was disappearing. You are not separate from that ending. You are one of the ways it continued. Modern researchers keep circling back to the same unresolved question. Was it climate? Was it competition for food? Was it simply demographic bad luck, a small population that could not absorb enough shocks to keep going? The honest answer is that it was probably all three layered together over thousands of years in ways no single excavation can fully untangle. Science rarely gets a clean answer for something this old. What it gets instead is fragments. A shell midden here, a hearth there, a genome sequenced from a 50,000-year-old bone fragment. Each piece adding a little more shape to a story that will likely never be complete. Consider what daily life actually looked like in those final years. You would have woken before dawn because the cave held onto the cold longer than the open air outside. You would have checked the tide line first, since shellfish were the most reliable meal on the calendar, unaffected by whether the deer herds had moved on or the rains had failed again. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal teeth from sites across Iberia shows a diet that shifted with the seasons and with the landscape, sometimes leaning heavily on marine resources, sometimes on hunted game, sometimes on both within the same year. This was not a rigid, unchanging lifestyle. It was constant improvisation, the kind that only comes from generations of hard-won knowledge about exactly which resources could be trusted when everything else became unreliable. You would have known your small group by heart. Every voice, every cough, every limp. Anthropologists studying Neanderthal skeletal remains have found repeated evidence of serious injuries that healed, broken ribs, fractured limbs, even one skull with a partially healed head wound, which tells you something important. These people were caring for their injured long enough for bones to mend. Someone brought food to a person who could not hunt. Someone kept a fire going for someone too weak to gather wood. That is not the behavior of an unfeeling, doomed species stumbling toward its own end. That is a community, functioning exactly the way communities function, right up until it becomes too small to keep functioning at all. And smallness may be the real villain in this story, more than any single dramatic cause. Population geneticists modeling ancient group sizes suggest many Neanderthal bands may have consisted of fewer than 30 individuals, isolated by mountain ranges, rivers, and vast stretches of unfamiliar territory. A group that size cannot easily recover from a single bad season. Lose a skilled hunter to injury, lose 2 infants to a hard winter, lose an elder who remembered where the reliable water sources were during a drought decades earlier, and the group's margin for survival narrows every single time. Multiply that across hundreds of isolated groups spread from Iberia to Siberia over thousands of years, and slow decline stops looking like a mystery. It starts looking like simple arithmetic. Meanwhile, on the other side of that story, something different was happening. Modern human populations arriving in Europe seem to have maintained wider kinship networks, exchanging not just goods but people, through practices that connected distant groups into something closer to a web than a scatter of isolated dots. If a hunting party from one group encountered strangers from another region, there was a chance they shared a common ancestor, a common ritual, even a common language family, which made cooperation more likely than conflict. That web meant information could travel. A new flint knapping technique discovered in one valley might reach another valley within a single generation. A warning about a harsh winter route might reach a neighboring group before it was too late. Neanderthal groups, more isolated by both geography and apparent social structure, did not have the same reach. Innovation, when it happened, often stayed local and disappeared when the group that held it disappeared too. None of this means Neanderthals were less intelligent. The archaeological record firmly rejects that old assumption. They made sophisticated stone tools using a technique called Levallois flaking, requiring the toolmaker to visualize a finished blade hidden inside a raw stone core before striking a single blow. They used natural adhesives, made from heating birch bark in a low-oxygen environment, to fix stone points onto wooden shafts, a process modern engineers have had genuine difficulty replicating by hand. They almost certainly use symbolic ornamentation, including pierced shells and pigments found alongside their remains at multiple sites. Every marker researchers once used to separate them from you, tool complexity, symbolic thought, care for the injured, has been found again and again in the Neanderthal record. The gap between their minds and yours was never as wide as the story once claimed. So why did one branch continue and the other quietly stop? Chris Stringer's answer, built from decades comparing fossil evidence across continents, is that it likely was not a single reason at all, but a compounding one. Slightly lower birth rates, slightly smaller networks, slightly less redundancy when the climate turned harsh. None of these differences needed to be dramatic on their own. Over 10,000 years, even a small statistical disadvantage becomes an ending. Extinction seen this way is rarely a single dramatic event. It is usually just an accumulation of small disadvantages, compounding quietly, generation after generation, until one day there simply is no next generation. That brings you back to the cave on the Gibraltar coastline, the fire burning low, the tide rolling in exactly as it had for 100,000 years before that morning, and would for tens of thousands of years after. Whoever the last Neanderthal actually was, they did not know their species was ending because species-level extinction is invisible from the inside. It only exists in hindsight, pieced together 40,000 years later by scientists with radiocarbon dating and DNA sequencers. In that moment, in that cave, there was no ending. There was only a person going about an ordinary day in a life indistinguishable in its smallest details from any other. So the next time you feel your skin react strangely to sunlight, or notice you sleep lighter than people around you, or catch a cold that hits differently than it hits someone else, consider the possibility that some tiny fragment of that inheritance is doing exactly what it has done for tens of thousands of years, quietly persisting, long after the body it first belonged to went still in a cave overlooking the sea. You are standing at the edge of that same story right now. You just don't call it a cave anymore.